Hello and welcome. Now we are starting with the latest from West Africa, where the new year has kicked in with a renewed anti-colonial sentiment. Another nation in the region has joined the France Out chorus, and that is Ivory Coast. Ivory Coast President Alassane Ouattara has announced that French forces will withdraw from the West African nation this month. He made the announcement in an end-of-year speech.
My dear compatriots, dear brothers and sisters, we can be proud of our army, whose modernization is now a reality. It is within this framework that we have decided on the coordinated and organized withdrawal of French forces from Ivory Coast. Thus, the camp of the 43rd Marine Infantry Battalion in Port Bouet will be handed over to the armed forces of Ivory Coast starting this January 2025.
Hours before Ivory Coast, Senegal also confirmed that French troops will leave the nation by the end of this year. The Senegalese president, Bassirou Diomaye Faye, has said that this year would see an end to all foreign military presence in the country. Earlier, he also announced France would have to close its military bases on its territory. 2024 has been a tough year for France in West and Central Africa, and setbacks for Paris have clearly spilled into the new year. Over the last 2 years, France was forced out of several of its former colonies. It started with the Coup belt of West Africa after the military government took charge in Mali, Burkina Faso and Niger. They kicked France out, and then Chad, which was considered France's most stable and loyal partner in Africa, abruptly ended its military cooperation with its former colonial power. Now France has handed over its first military base in the country. Now, most recently, Senegal and Ivory Coast have joined the list. With some 600 troops, Ivory Coast is currently home to the biggest remaining contingent of French troops in West Africa. Since the independence of French colonies, France had maintained a policy of economic, political and military sway in Africa. This policy, dubbed as Francafrique, included having thousands of permanent troops in the region. But now, France has been kicked out of more than 70% of African countries. The French remain only in Djibouti, in the Horn of Africa, with 1,500 soldiers, and in Gabon, with 350 troops. The latest members announcing France's ouster, Ivory Coast and Senegal, are also members of the regional bloc ECOWAS. The group is accused by the West African junta nations of being a puppet of the West. Military leaders of Niger, Mali and Burkina Faso have split from ECOWAS and have instead formed their own alliance. They have ditched ties with the West and have forged closer relations with Russia. Taking advantage of the anti-West sentiment, Russia quickly filled the void. Its mercenaries are deployed across the Sahel to help them to fight Islamist insurgents who are active in the region. As France loses its influence, political watchers believe it has been making efforts to revive its waning political and military clout in Africa. As per reports, Paris is devising a new military strategy in the continent. It is deliberately downscaling military ties, a measure that would sharply reduce its permanent troop presence on the continent. There is only one exception, and that is Djibouti. Djibouti, where France has some 1,500 troops deployed, could now assume a greater role in Paris's Africa strategy. French President Emmanuel Macron recently visited the Horn of Africa nation. He said the French military base in the country would be reinvented as a projection point for the country's missions in Africa. Currently, the base is more focused on the Red Sea, the Indian Ocean, and the Indo-Pacific than it is on Africa. But now it could focus more on Africa amid a series of setbacks in the rest of the continent. Could Macron's new strategy in Africa work out for Paris, or is it the end of Francafrique? Now, for more on this, we have with us Beverly Achieng, a senior analyst, Francophone Africa at Control Risks. Achieng is joining us live from Dakar, Senegal. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you for having me, and Happy New Year to you.
And Happy New Year to you. Let's jump right in. What are the primary reasons behind the Ivory Coast decision to ask French troops to leave? And how does this reflect the growing anti-French sentiment in the region?
Well, to be honest, it feels as if President Alassane Ouattara is preempting the growth of anti-French sentiment. This is an election year for Côte d'Ivoire, and he has to make decisive decisions to make it seem as though the election is going to be independent, that France-Afrique is not going to influence future politics, security, policies, or even interregional relations. Anti-French sentiment has targeted Côte d'Ivoire over the years, particularly coming from the Sahel, where military rulers they accuse Côte d'Ivoire of hosting rare bases for France. They're pro-Russian and anti-Western activists who have been targeting Côte d'Ivoire with anti-French sentiment as a way of trying to make it come from the country naturally. It hasn't happened, but if it does emerge during the election, the presence of French forces is likely to undermine that election or undermine a potential re-election of Ouattara as we wait for him to either declare his candidacy or not, and what his policy will be in the future.
And Beverly, how does the removal of the French troops from the Ivory Coast, following the similar moves by Burkina Faso, Niger, and others, impact France's strategic and security influence in West Africa?
Well, France now has to realign its presence in the region because of the hostilities coming from military governments and even from the public. So one of the things it is doing, as you pointed out, is realigning how many forces will be present in the region. Quite a number have reduced due to hostilities with governments, but also being proactive about pulling down its own troops. It also just means that France may have to think of other strategic points to be influential. So outside of politics and security, economic influence. The recent visit to France by the Nigerian President Bola Tinubu, where he signed agreements in agriculture and broad spectrum of the economy, is one area that France is looking at. And also, interestingly, Kenya will be hosting one of the very first France-Africa summits, which has always been held in France. So France is looking actively for new allies while also trying to reduce its presence, especially under President Macron, because he has been the one who has faced the most backlash from Francophone West Africa. And this has had a ripple effect on French commercial interests, which are now diversifying across the continent.
And with countries like Senegal and Chad, who were once considered France's reliable partners in the continent, now also distancing themselves, what does this mean for the future of France's relationships and foreign policy in Africa? We've seen a shift in focus toward Djibouti.
Yes, I mean, the Djibouti coast is quite strategic. It's at the Red Sea. There are lots of other military bases that are present there, including China, the US. It's an area where security operations and cooperation has been quite strong given the insurgency from Al-Shabaab, but also giving it a window into some of the confluences of political interest in East and Central Africa because it extends quite a bit. So France might shift its security policy more to Djibouti and use that as an anchor to influence the region with the Al-Shabaab insurgency, win hearts and minds, particularly in Kenya, in addition to the economic policy that it's building with the France-Africa summit that will be held there. But then increasingly in the West, reduce its military political presence and only have some economic presence, given the hostilities that some French commercial interests are likely to face, given the wave of anti-French protests. But in the long run, East and even Anglophone-speaking countries might be influential to France's future policy under Macron, while in Francophone West Africa, we're going to see an emergence of other countries like Russia, Turkey, and China in commercial and security interests.
Right. Beverly, we'll leave it there. Thank you very much for joining us on Firstpost Africa, sharing your views, especially on this New Year's Day.